So first of all, thank you so much to everyone for joining me today, again on a Thursday evening. Hopefully there'll be some familiar faces, and welcome to anybody that's new. So just before we get started, I wanted to give a quick shout out again to the Bite Medicine platform. So I'm sure you guys are really familiar with the fact that the platform includes a question bank and also an online textbook. And as someone that recently graduated from medical school, I used Bite Medicine throughout my 4th and 5th year and found it to be such a useful learning aid. So if you haven't already had the opportunity, definitely go and check out their resources through the link in the top right hand of the screen. So for those of you who I met in the last session, you'll know a little bit about me already, but for those of you who are new, I just thought I'd take another opportunity to reintroduce myself. So my name is Shivani. I am a graduate of the University of Birmingham Medical School, and when I applied to the SFP last year, I applied in the West Midlands and London, and I'm currently an SFP doctor in medical education in the West Midlands. When I applied, I ranked 5th in my deanery, so the West Midlands, which is a deanery that includes white space questions. And in terms of kind of my aspirations going forward, I'm thinking along the lines of a medical career, and I currently have roles in research, teaching, and clinical work. And I put my details there at the bottom of this slide. I'm always very happy to take questions about anything to do with academic medicine or the SFP, so do make a note of them and please reach out to me. I will try and get back to you as soon as possible. So, as a kind of quick reminder of the series, the SFP series is something that I'm working on with Bite Medicine. It's a 7-session series, and we are on session 2, which is about white space questions. We have already had one session last week, which is all about deciding on and preparing your application. Don't worry if you missed it, the session was recorded and you can access it through the Bite Medicine platform or on YouTube as well. So in terms of today's session, we're going to primarily focus on the white space questions. So what I'm going to be talking about is what they are, first of all, the types of white space questions, and I'm going to be using my experience to tell you a bit about what I think makes the perfect white space question answer. And I'm going to use a couple of examples to illustrate what I think would be answers that could be improved, and also what I think would be ideal answers. So in terms of kind of interactivity in this session, we are going to be using Menti again today. So I put the code there at the bottom of the screen. If you guys can make a note of it, there will be some interactive points. And I mentioned as well, I've got a few instances where I have put in designated stops so I can take some questions. So don't feel like you'll have to wait to the end of the session to ask me questions. I'm very happy to answer as I go along. So first of all, just to give me a bit of a better idea of how you guys are getting on with your white space questions and where you're at, I've got a little bit of an icebreaker quiz through Menti. So if you guys go to menti.com and use the code at the top of the screen, which is 55465149. Firstly, I just want to get an idea of who you guys are and where you're at in terms of your medical school careers. So if I now switch over to Menti, I can see that the vast majority of you are final years, and we've got a couple of 3rd years in the room as well. So welcome to everybody. This session is very, very useful to you final years. I know you've got your deadline coming up, so that's really useful to know. So if we go back to the next question, this question is essentially asking you what you already know about white space questions and why deaneries use them. So again, if you use the same link and go to menti.com, let's have a look. So looks like most of you are aware of what white space questions are. A few of you are a bit more uncertain. So don't worry, we're going to be covering that a little bit in the session. And hopefully by the end of the session, you'll be a lot clearer on what white space questions are and what they're really looking for. So the next question is about your confidence in feeling like you can write good white space questions. So again, if you go to menti.com, let's have a look at how you guys are feeling. Oh, looks like you guys aren't feeling that confident in writing some white space questions. That's really useful to know. Don't feel afraid at this point. Hopefully by the end of the session, the whole process of writing a good white space question will become a lot clearer. And as I say, there's going to be lots of opportunities for you to ask me questions as we go along as well. And finally, this one is more orientated at the final years. But have you guys started writing your white space questions yet? Let's have a look. Okay, good. So actually a lot of you haven't started writing yet. So this session is going to be hopefully really well pitched to you because it's going to give you a few ideas of what to think about before you start writing, as well as during the writing process as well. So thank you so much to everybody for answering that. That's given me a much better idea of where you guys are at in terms of where you're at in terms of your white space questions. So let's now talk about the basics of white space questions, starting with what they actually are. So white space questions are a series of questions that are standardized nationally, and they're used to screen potential academic candidates in lots of different deaneries. They cover lots of different topics, including kind of why you want to apply to the program, key skill sets that you could bring to the program, and also a bit of your lateral thinking and ability to solve problems as well. And as I say, the aim of this section of the application is to assess your motivation and suitability for the SFP program before the interview rounds. It's important to bear in mind that not all deaneries use these white space questions. So when you're planning your application, it's really important to look at your specific deanery guidance before you sit down and write your questions to make sure that they use them. Because if you're applying to deaneries that don't use them, you don't have to fill this out on the Oriel platform. In the same kind of vein, not all deaneries use all the questions. So some deaneries will specify which questions they look at, in which case you only have to answer those questions. If the deanery doesn't specify which questions they're specifically looking at, I would say it's better to assume that they are going to look at all of them and put down an answer for all of them so that you've covered all of your bases. So on the right-hand side here, I've got a picture of what the white space questions look like, and I've included a copy of the link where you can find them through the UKFPO website. Something I just want to highlight is that the program interests section of this application is actually a white space question. So when you put down research, education and teaching, or leadership and management, it brings up a box for you to talk about your program interests. So make sure that when you're filling out your application, you make sure that you put down an answer in that box as well, because it's not very clear from looking at this document that that is an actual question. So let's now think about something called the person specification, because as I'm going to talk about in a moment, knowing about the person specification is really important when putting together a good white space question. So the person specification is essentially the foundation program's list of all the qualities that they would ideally want in a graduating doctor from medical school. And it's the basis for recruiting both SFP and all doctors across all deaneries. So it kind of dictates what clinical and academic and professional qualities that all qualified doctors should have. And when you're approaching your white space questions, it's really important that you look through and understand this person specification and demonstrate the qualities that are listed in this specification in your white space questions. And again, this on the right-hand side is a picture of this year's person specification. So you can see it breaks down the skills and qualities that you're meant to have into categories. And you can find the copy of the person specification on the foundation website. And I've got a link there for you. So now that we've kind of had a bit of an introduction to white space questions, I'm going to break down types of white space questions for you, because when thinking about white space questions, it's important to consider the themes that you need to answer and what each of those themes is actually asking you. So there are 5 themes of white space questions, and they are career goals, programs interests, prior experience, team working, and a general category. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to break down what each of those categories mean. So starting with career goals, essentially this is what it says on the tin. So it's designed to assess what your academic and clinical interests are, what your goals are for your career, but importantly, you need to demonstrate that you understand what the SFP is and how it relates to the academic training pathway. So those of you who attended last week's session will know a little bit about the academic pathway. I talked about it in the last session. If you weren't able to catch that, I recommend you go back and watch that lecture to understand a bit more about the academic pathway and read around about it on the National Institute of Health and Care Research website, because demonstrating an understanding of how the SFP fits into that pathway is really important in this section of the white space questions. The next section is program interests. So this is where you talk about the specific SFPs that you are looking to apply to, and you state what you would like to gain from those specific SFPs. So essentially, it's about you justifying why you've applied to certain programs and your understanding of the departments that you've applied to. Prior experience is what it says on the tin. So essentially, it's looking at what skills and what experience can you bring to the SFP program. And this includes both academic experience, but don't forget clinical experience as well, because ultimately you are going to be a doctor first. And so it's really important in the white space questions to demonstrate a mixture of clinical and academic skills. In the team working section, again, this is somewhat what it says on the tin. So it's the idea that you understand what makes someone a good and effective member of the MDT. And the idea is you're meant to demonstrate your understanding of the MDT and who you can reach to for support and what those other MDT members can bring to you as a doctor. And finally, the general category is probably the vaguest category. It was a category that was introduced newly last year. And in my view, and based on my experience, this category is generally testing your critical and lateral thinking skills. So it's testing, can you think about problems in a critical way and both suggest and identify what the problem is and come up with effective solutions. So it's all about demonstrating self-awareness and an understanding of where things might go wrong and providing effective solutions. So now that we've talked about what each of the themes of the SFP white space questions are, let's now move on to talk about what actually makes the perfect white space question answer. So when we think about writing an effective white space question answer or academic writing in general, I'd like to let you know that there are two equally important aspects that you need to be thinking about as you're writing these. So the first thing to think about is what you say, so the content of your answer. The second thing you need to think about is how you say it, so how well you articulate that answer. So in terms of what you say, things that you might want to consider covering are your key skills and achievements, how you specifically demonstrate an aptitude for the program, and as I said before, how you meet the recruitment person specification. In terms of how you say it, things to think about are obviously spelling, punctuation, and grammar, making your answers concise and succinct, making your answers well evidenced and well structured with a clear organization that makes it easy for people reading your answer to understand the content of the question. And when you're writing, it's really important to pay equal attention to both of these aspects, because you can have the most amazing portfolio in the world, but if it's not well articulated and not easy to understand from your white space questions, your recruitment officers will not have the time to sit and pick apart your answers to understand just how good a candidate you are. So make their life easy, make your answers well written, and it will sell yourself to them. So let's now think about a generalized summary approach of how to write your white space questions. So if we look at kind of the time between now and when you have to submit your answers on the 20th of September, I've broken down the process of writing your white space question answers into 3 easy chunks, okay? So starting with the first chunk, this is all about before you start writing. And you'll notice that this section is quite big because part of the key to writing a good white space question is planning well in advance before you even put pen to paper. So as I said before, you need to familiarize yourself with the skills you need to demonstrate on the person specification. And you need to have a good understanding of the deaneries you're applying to, the programs you're applying to, and what they can offer you and why that fits into your long-term career goals. You need to look into which white space questions are required by your deanery. And we're going to talk about this a little bit more in a second, but you need to look at your portfolio and assimilate the information that you would like to include in your white space questions and plan out how they map to the white space questions. Importantly, at this stage, I would say it's important to get in touch with people that you would like to read your white space questions. So that could be various academic mentors, to let them know in advance that you'd like to send them your questions so that they have plenty of time to allow for proofreading. Let's now move on to look at what you should be doing during the writing phase. So Rome wasn't built in a day, and similarly, neither are white space questions. So when you're writing, I would say try to plan time to work on the questions every few days. And leaving those breaks will mean that your brain is mentally fresh when you come back to read those questions, and you're better able to pick out mistakes or things that you would like to improve on in your questions. Before you even start filling out your answer, what I would say is write out and plan the structure that you're planning to use in each question, and populate that structure with bullet points, which we would have planned in our before writing stage. To make sure that you've covered all of the points that you wanted to discuss, I would say have a copy of your portfolio next to your bullet pointed list to check that you've included everything that you wanted to include in those questions. And once you've populated all of the white space questions that you need to answer with bullet points, then you can begin to restructure with sentences because you've got the content down, and that's when you need to start working on the articulation phase. Once you've got your white space questions written, as I say, leave breaks and proofread every few days to increase your ability to spot errors. And email drafts of your white space questions to your academic mentors and supervisors. And I would recommend emailing to a mixture of current SFP doctors who have been through the process recently, but also academic mentors that know you from your projects and who might be further down the academic training pathway. So they have a good insight into you and what you offer the program, and also have more experience as an academic clinician. Once you are happy with the draft of your white space questions that you've got, make sure that you upload your questions to Oriel as soon as possible, because invariably a few days before the deadline, Oriel will crash. And so you need to make sure that your white space questions are saved and ready for you to submit well in advance of the deadline. And finally, for a lot of the deaneries that use white space questions, they often form a crux to talk about at interview. So when you submit your questions, make sure that you save a copy of your white space questions so that when you come to prepare for your interviews, you've got a copy to look back to in the preparation phase to familiarize yourself with what you wrote, because you may well be asked about this in the interview. So I thought this was quite a little nice summary slide. So I just want to pause here to allow you guys to screenshot this if you haven't already. And Byte Medicine have very helpfully digitized this. So we'll be releasing a copy for you to download tomorrow as well to help you with your writing. Okay, so let's now move on to talking about putting together your portfolio, which is the first stage when you're ready to start writing your question. What I mean by assimilating your portfolio is essentially looking back across all of the things that you've achieved from an academic perspective and putting them all in one space so that you can have a look and see the breadth and depth of experience that you have in one space. And there are lots of different ways to do this. So I know people that have used Excel and Post-it notes. I personally liked Notion for doing this, but essentially whatever works in terms of creating a summary of all of your academic achievements. So this is just an example of what mine looked like when I applied. I've just kind of anonymized it to avoid distracting from the points. And you can see that I've got lots of different sections according to the type of achievement. And I've put a new page in under each heading so that I know how many of each achievement that I've got, and inside I'd included a little summary of what each achievement was. So that way I can see all in one space what all of my achievements were at the time of application. And I personally use Notion, so this is what I made in Notion at the time of my application. So once you've got a visual representative of your portfolio, now you can start to think about what points you'd like to talk about in which white space questions. So spend time allocating the skills and points that you want to talk about into each of the 5 themes. And it's really important to use the person specification when you're doing this to make sure that you've demonstrated all of the skills that are included in that specification. So if we take an example, this is the 5 themes that we talked about for the white space questions. And I could say I've looked at the person specification, and the green boxes are the skills that I want to demonstrate in each of these kind of categories. So in team working, I want to talk about good communication. In prior experience, I want to talk about my commitment to the program, my ability to prioritize, and my ability to deal with pressure. So now that I've allocated skills to each of the 5 themes of white space questions, I can then look back at the summary portfolio that I made and think, which of these achievements best demonstrate that skill? So say, for example, I could say Research B is a good example of where I've dealt with pressure, and when I organized a teaching program, that shows a good example of time prioritization. And this way, what you can ensure is that A, you've covered all of the skills you need to discuss in the person specification, and you can clearly see which achievements you've used in which areas of the white space questions so that you can avoid repeating yourself and make sure that you've used as broad a range of experience as possible. And remember, when we're writing these, we do want to make sure that we're including a mixture of both academic and clinical experience, because ultimately you will be a doctor first. So that's a lot of information to take on board. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to pause here, and I can see a few questions in the Q&A already. So I'm going to take an opportunity to answer these. Feel free to drop some in, and we'll just spend a little bit of time answering some questions. So somebody has said, can I use the same experience or answer for 2 white space questions, but use a different reflection from the same experience? So I would say technically you can, but I would recommend against it, because ultimately you don't want to come across as repeating yourself, and it doesn't really show that you've got a good breadth of experience. So try and choose different experiences for each white space question. And that's why planning it in advance is really important. So are there white space questions for the priority programs? To be honest, I'm not entirely sure of this because I didn't apply to a priority program. I don't believe that there are white space questions for this, but I would double check on the UK FPO website. Okay, do we need to reference our answers? So no, you don't need to include references. But what I would say is anything that you write in your white space questions, make sure that you have the appropriate evidence to back up your statements, because although it's unlikely, they may well come and ask you for that evidence later on to prove the statements that you have included. So make sure that your answers are things that you can evidence. Any tips for finding academic mentors? So in terms of kind of people who can read your white space questions, what I would recommend is reaching out to people who you've worked on projects with previously, reaching out to faculty at the university. Sometimes there are careers departments at the university as well, who can advise on appropriate people to contact. And if you're really struggling, Twitter is a really great space to reach out to current SFP doctors who are more than happy to read your questions. So you can try there as well. Okay, so is it 250 words per question or 250 words per theme? So it's 250 words per question. And the way it looks on Oriel is you have a box which has a word limit in it. So when you copy and paste your answer across, you should be able to tell how close to the word limit you are. What I would recommend is writing your answers in Word or in a kind of similar word processing software. So that way you can easily highlight text and see what the word count is before you copy it across into Oriel. Okay, so does one examiner mark all of the white space questions, or does one examiner mark each white space question? If it is the case, it's a bad idea to refer to previous answers because the examiner may not have access to those answers. So I believe it is one examiner that reads all of the white space questions in a single application, but it may be one of those things that depends on the deanery. However, what I'd say is, regardless of how it's done, I would avoid referring back to previous answers and try and choose distinct experiences to talk about in each answer so that you avoid overlap, because you don't want to come across as repeating yourself. And again, you can't assume that the examiner will have read the previous answers as well. Okay. Do you know if any deaneries put a bigger weighting to white space questions? So obviously, it depends on the deanery. There are some deaneries that put more emphasis on the white space questions than others. So say, for example, in London, they don't use white space questions at all. Whereas in Birmingham, it was a more even split between white space questions and the interview, or at least they use the white space questions as the initial screening phase to decide whether or not you secured an interview. So it's one of those things that depends on the area that you apply to. And in the SFP handbook for each deanery, you should be able to find out the information, or if not, you can email the deanery and ask them. Do you need to hit the 250 word limit? So you don't have to, but what I would say is those 250 words are all you have to sell yourself to people who don't know you. So what I would say is try and use that word limit in as productive a way as possible. If you genuinely feel like you've answered the question well without coming up to 250 words, that's okay. But try to make sure your answers are well filled out and well structured, and that may well bring you up to the 250 word limit anyway. Okay, so I'm going to move on with the next session and save the last couple of questions that have just come through, just in the interest of time. So let's now move on to talk about what happens during the writing phase. And the way I'm going to do this is I've got a couple of examples of white space questions, and we're going to talk about what's potentially to be improved in these answers and look at how we can improve that. So this is the first example that I want to look at. It says, as a medical student, I contributed to a research study in which I gained lots of research skills. Having this previous experience will benefit me during an SFP. And what I'd like you to do is go to menti.com, go to the word cloud, and I would like you to tell me why you think this is an ineffective point. Okay. So if we go over to Menti, you should be able to type in why you think this point is ineffective. Good. Okay, so we're getting some answers through. Not specific, no reflection. Excellent. Well done, guys. Yeah, no details, vague. Good. Okay, so we are picking up on a general theme here, which is the idea that it's not specific and it looks quite vague. Okay, so let's have a look at what I thought about this. So these are the areas that I've highlighted that I think could be improved on. So you're absolutely right. The first thing is that whoever's written this has not been specific about their experience. And the problem with this is that it makes it sound very generic. Remember, this is your one opportunity to sell yourself to the interviewers. So make it as personal to you as possible so that they remember you. Again, the candidate hasn't been specific in naming the academic skills that they gained. So it sounds very wishy-washy. And compounding that, they haven't linked back to that all-important person specification as well, which means that it looks quite generic and it doesn't demonstrate to us as readers that they've understood what makes a good SFP doctor. And finally, and potentially this is quite a common error, but the candidate here has assumed that just because they have experience, that makes them suitable for the SFP, when actually what you need to be doing is thinking about why that specific experience will benefit you during the program, and you need to specifically state that in your answer. So let's look at some tips to see how we can overcome this. So first of all, if we think about things that are good practice to overcome this, as I say, make your answers as specific and personal to you as possible. So mention specific experiences that are unique to you that will be memorable, and highlight, using the person specification, the specific skills that you gained. It's important to be reflective as well. So think back on what you learned from your experience, and all importantly, make sure you always link back to why that skill makes you suitable for the SFP program, or how having that specific skill will help you during your academic block. Things to avoid, as we've seen in that past example, are using generic statements and language such as lots of, or this makes me suitable, or I have plenty, because that is completely meaningless to somebody that doesn't know you. And again, avoid assuming that having an experience alone is enough to demonstrate that you're a good candidate. So you always need to think about what you learn and why that specific aspect makes you suitable. So here is my top tip for making an effective point. And for those of you who have done English literature in any degree in your school will remember this technique called PEA. So this is my revised version. So first of all, when you're writing these statements, think about the point that you want to make. So what specific skill or attribute do you want to develop? Then you want to think about the evidence. So what aspect of your portfolio best demonstrates your ability to show that skill? And finally, you want to think about the analysis. And this is all about linking the evidence, so the situation from your portfolio, to the skill that you want to demonstrate, your point. And the way you do this is by reflecting on what you learned from the scenario, and always specifically saying why that would make you suitable for the SFP. So let's now take these tips and apply this to our answer. And here it says, as a medical student, I contributed to a systematic review investigating a topic in which I taught myself how to conduct literature searches and perform meta-analysis. This previous experience demonstrates I can learn new academic skills rapidly and independently, which I would apply to quickly acquire the skills needed to undertake my research project and maximize my protected time in my academic rotation. So let's look at why applying our tips has made this an effective answer. So firstly, the person that's written this has described a specific scenario that is unique to them. So no one else will have this experience in this particular situation. They've also mentioned the specific skills that they gain from the scenario. And more importantly, almost, they've demonstrated why this experience demonstrates they have aspects of the person specification. They then go on to say why that previous experience would actually specifically help them in an SFP post. And quite nicely at the end, they talk about an understanding of what the SFP post will give them, i.e. the protected time to carry out whatever it is they're working on in their academic rotation. So you can see that by being specifically, we've drastically improved this answer, made it more unique, and sold ourselves in a much better capacity to demonstrate why we both understand what an SFP involves and also why we'd be well suited to it. So let's now look at a second white space question example. So this is a time when I overcame a challenge was when I delivered a teaching session and the students were reluctant to answer questions. I overcame the problem by switching to using a voting system in the session, which meant that more students engaged in answering questions. So again, what I'd like you to do is go back to Menti, and I want you to type in why you think this is an ineffective answer, okay? Good. So we've already hit the nail on the head, so no reflection. Does anyone else have any other thoughts on why this isn't a good answer? Yeah, nice. So we've highlighted the fact that it's quite descriptive and not very reflective. Good. Yes, nice. So we haven't linked back to why we are suitable for the SFP. Well done. Any other thoughts on this one? Okay, well done, guys. I think you've pretty much hit the nail on the head there. So let's talk about how we can actually improve this answer now. So these are the points that I think could be worked on in this answer. So firstly, as we highlighted before, the candidate has been very generic. So they've just said they've delivered a teaching session, and that's quite vague. It doesn't give us anything unique about the student. It doesn't give us anything to work off that would be unique or memorable to them. Then, as we kind of picked up in that word cloud, the student has kind of focused their answer on what they did in the scenario, but they don't necessarily reflect on why this strategy was effective and what they learned from the scenario. So what is the transferable skill that they could take away? And as somebody again very well highlighted, ultimately, they don't demonstrate why this situation shows that they would be good for the SFP. So the way to overcome this sort of answer is to use something called the STAR technique when you're writing. And this is an example of a structure that you could use in your writing phase to specifically structure your answer with bullet points before you link it together with sentences. So some of you may be familiar with this already, but in case you're not, I'm going to go through it now. So the first step is to briefly outline the situation. So what was going on at the time? And this should be no more than 1 or 2 sentences. Then you want to talk about within that situation, what was the problem or what was the task that needed to be done? And again, this should be 1 or maximum 2 sentences to capture the problem. Then you want to talk about the actions. So you want to specifically talk about what you did, not what the team did, what you did in this scenario to act on the task. And again, this should be a brief sentence or 2, and it should include active language. So things like I reached out to, or I called, or I did, rather than the team did, or using things that sound quite passive. Then you want to briefly outline what the result of your specific action was to the scenario. And most importantly, and this bit should form the bulk of your answer, you want to think about why your action worked to achieve the result and what you learned from that scenario. And most importantly, why what you learn is applicable to the SFP. So let's look at how we can apply that in this answer. So this is quite a long one. I'm going to give you a minute to read that yourselves. I'm not going to read that one out. Okay, so hopefully you'll have had a minute to skim read that answer. Let's now have a look at why this is effective. Before we do that, I just want to show you what the STAR structure looks like in this answer. So I've highlighted how each of the sentences correlates to the structure that we use. And you can see that the situation, task, action, and result are all only 1 sentence or even half a sentence. And that actually the majority of our answer is all about reflection. And when you're writing, you can go through and check your answers by doing a similar thing. So highlighting each of the sections of the framework that you've used to double check that the majority of your answer is focused on the reflection bit. So if we now look at what's effective in this answer, firstly, the person that's written this has been really specific and mentioned an example that is unique to them, which makes the answer more memorable. The second thing is they've succinctly highlighted what the problem is in 1 sentence. They then mention what their specific action was. So they talk about the first person and they use active language such as switching to, encouraged, to highlight their specific action. They then specifically consider why their adaptation was effective. And what's particularly useful in this scenario to highlight that is they've actually used the phrase on reflection, which is a very clear sign to whoever's reading it that this is now the last section of that STAR framework. They then specifically mention skills that are in the person specification that they gained from this scenario, and they link that back very nicely to why this makes them suitable for the SFP. So you can see that just by applying our star structure, we've given a much more formatted answer, which is focused on our learning and reflection, and we've clearly demonstrated why we are good candidates for the SFP. So again, that's a lot of information to take on. So I'm going to spend a couple of minutes answering a couple of questions. So should we tailor our white space questions to a specific program or school? How do we do this if we are applying to 2 schools that use white space questions? So if you're only applying to one deanery, definitely make sure that your answers are tailored to that school. So say, for example, Birmingham was the only deanery that I applied to using white space questions, so all of my answers were tailored for them. If we're doing this for 2 schools, it is a bit more tricky. Obviously, the skill-based answers can be generic, so they don't have to be specific to the program or school. But ultimately, the deaneries are understanding of the fact that you might be applying to more than one space. So just make sure that you're paying equal attention in the program answers to each of the deaneries that you're applying to. If you presented an audit at an international conference, with a DOI link be enough as evidence? Yes, just anything like a certificate or something to show that you attended the conference. It depends what the DOI link is to be able to specifically answer that. So this is a good one. When do you use the STAR technique over PEA? So I would say the STAR technique is particularly good for situation or skill-based questions. The PEA technique is perhaps kind of used within a sentence or within a couple of sentences. So say, for example, within the STAR technique, in the reflection bit, you could use the PEA technique. But the STAR one would probably be most suitable for the skill-based questions. Please, can we see the STAR slide again to screenshot? Don't worry, you'll get a copy of these slides after the session. And obviously, if people want to see that again, I'm very happy to show that again at the end of the presentation. Do we think it's better to give a clinical or an academic example if we are applying for research? So what I would say is effective is use a mixture of both and use the example which you think best demonstrates the quality the question is asking for. I would say, obviously, you're applying to an SFP post, so you do need to make sure that you've included the vast majority of your answers related to the academic side, but maybe include 1 or 2 clinical situations depending on what you think is appropriate. That's something that is entirely up to you. So how do I provide evidence of teaching? Google Forms, certificates, or both? Both is equally good, to be honest. As I say, this is very unlikely that they will come asking for questions, but it's just good practice to keep good evidence of what you are writing in your answers. When are the white space questions released? So this year's questions have already been released. Typically, they're released at the end of August. So you can have a look on the UKFPA website. If we were involved in projects, but they did not result in tangible outcomes for additional points, could you still talk about them in the white space questions? Yeah, absolutely, because ultimately by working on that project, you've still gained important research skills, even if they haven't led to a formal output just yet. So you could always sell that experience in terms of the skills and experience that you gained in that regard. Of course, your tips are valuable for interviews wherever you're based, but do you know if there is a white space equivalent for medical students in Australia? I'm really sorry, I'm not very familiar with the Australian application process, so I'm not able to answer that question, I'm afraid. Quick question about points. If you have a publication that's been accepted but not yet published, can you include this, and would you be likely to score points? So can I perhaps answer this over Messenger at another time point, just because I want to keep us on track for talking about white space questions, if that's okay. So let's now move on to the last part. And this section is all about what you kind of do after you've got your white space questions written down and you're kind of gearing up towards uploading them to the website. The first thing I want to do is give you guys some equipment to be able to troubleshoot common problems that you might face when you've got your first draft of your white space questions. And this is just to give you a better idea of how you can go about fixing your answers and thinking critically about how you could improve your answers yourself before you go forward and seek feedback. So the first thing I commonly hear is that, oh, my answer sounds too wishy-washy. And as we've talked about before, often the cause of that is you've not been specific enough in your answer. So ways to overcome that are to mention specific details of your experience. So what you did, who it was to, and mention the specifics of the project you once worked on. And another thing is to quantify your achievements with numbers, so fact-based evidence. So say, for example, I could say, I have achieved lots of outputs from my research experience. But what would be better if I said, I have achieved 5 publications, 10 presentations, and 3 prizes from my research experience. And you can see that just by using and quantifying my statement with numbers, it makes it a lot more specific and personal to me. The next kind of common problem is that your answer doesn't actually answer the question. And often this is due to kind of the structure and the way you put together your answer. So the way to kind of overcome this is, firstly, in the first sentence of your paragraph, try to mirror the question in your answer. So say, for example, if the question is, like we saw earlier, when is a time that you've overcome a challenge? You could start your answer with, a time when I overcame a challenge is, and that way you very clearly signposted that you've answered the question. The second thing that you can think about doing is to write one sentence that answers the question. And then you can use the PEA technique that we talked about earlier to expand that point to create part of your answer. The other common problem that people talk about is that they lack structure in their answer. And we've talked about kind of ways to overcome this before, but particular ones that I want to highlight is firstly making use of paragraphs. So from memory, I believe you are able to use paragraphs in Oriel, but double check that. Even if not, you can still provide structure to your answer by using what's called signpost sentences. So this is essentially when you summarize the section you're going to talk about in the first sentence of your paragraph, or you use specific phrases to highlight what you're going to talk about next. So an example of this that we've looked at already is in that second example where I put, on reflection, and on reflection is an example of a signpost phrase. So I've very clearly highlighted at the start of that sentence that I'm going to be talking about reflection now. And using those sorts of phrases in your answer where you would have had the start of a new paragraph is a really effective way to help your reader logically follow your answer. Your answer comes across as too passive. This is another common problem, and this is all to do with the language that you've used. So make sure that you're using active verbs and language in your answers, and make sure that you're talking in the first person. This is the one example where you're allowed to talk about what you specifically did, not we and the team. So make sure that you're doing that to sell yourself properly. So leading on quite nicely, your answer doesn't sell yourself. And again, you need to make sure that to solve this, your answer is always focused on what you learned, what the transferable skill is, and make sure that at the end of every answer, you've linked back to why SFP, or why this makes you good for the SFP. And you can use one of those signpost sentences to even highlight that and say, this makes me a suitable candidate for the SFP because, and that way you very clearly highlighted that you've thought about it. Your answer is too long. This is a very common problem that people have. And to be honest, this is one where it's all about effective proofreading, because when you first write and put down your answers, it's very likely to not be in its most succinct form. And that's why I recommend proofreading every few days to give your brain a break, because if you get too used to reading something, you'll be less likely to pick up on errors and areas that you could potentially make it more succinct. The other thing to try is and break up your answer to put one sentence on each line, so you can see which sentences are shortest, which sentences are longest. And that will give you an idea of which sentences are the problem and which ones you need to cut down the word count for to individually before putting together your answer to make it all one cohesive paragraph. So let's now talk about effective proofreading once we've got our answers. And this is kind of a little checklist that I've put together to kind of help you guys in your proofreading phase. So when you're reading each answer, make sure that you've checked the content, but also basic things like spelling, punctuation, and grammar, the fact that it's well structured within the word limit, and using a mixture of variable sentences, and make sure that you're using formal language, so no abbreviations, no catchphrases and things like that. And most importantly, make sure that your answer answers the question specifically. And as I say, proofread every few days to make sure that you're as effective as you can be in this phase. So now let's think about what we do when we've got a draft that we're happy with, we've checked it, we troubleshooted it, and we're ready to send it off. So as I said before, notify the people you want to read your white space questions well in advance so they know to expect it, because the last thing you want is for a delay to hold up your ability to submit a question. People you can consider asking, as we talked about, are your friends and family. As lay people who obviously just read things by the by, they are very helpful and can provide a valuable input. Academic mentors, so supervisors, people at university, in the careers teams, and also current SFP doctors who ideally have applied to or worked in the deaneries that you are applying to. And just from personal experience of having both sent and received white space questions, I would say things that you could consider including when sending over your white space questions are as follows. So if you're sending your white space questions to somebody that doesn't know you, I would say try and include a bit of information about where you're applying, what your posts that you're applying to are, just so that the reader has a bit of context. And something that's also particularly useful is to highlight to whoever's reading which were the questions that you found most difficult and the ones that you want the most input for, because that means particularly if someone's time limited, they can spend their time focusing on those specific questions. And finally, if when you're reading and proofreading your white space questions, there are specific areas that you think could be improved, but at that point in time you can't quite see it, maybe consider highlighting those with a comment in your word processing document, so that way whoever's proofreading can specifically see those areas. Okay, so these are the references for the session, and that brings us quite nicely to the end of the session. So thank you so much for attending. Again, there are my contact details if you want to contact me about anything in the session. I'd be really grateful if you could fill out the feedback form by scanning the QR code. All of the feedback you give me is so useful, and I do take it on board every session. It would be really helpful for me to know what you guys thought of the session and how I can improve. So please do spend some time filling that out. And I'm happy to take some more questions now. So let's have a look. Do you know of any places we can find more good white space examples, especially for medical education SFPs? So what you can do is you can potentially reach out to friends who have applied to SFPs, and maybe ask them for a copy of their white space questions if they're happy. There's also a really great website called First Choice SFP or First Choice AFP, and they are essentially a company that have collated examples written by SFP doctors of white space questions. And when I was writing mine, I found their website very useful for having some examples of good white space questions. Okay. So how can we find SFP doctors in our chosen deanery? Struggling to find contacts at the moment. So if you are on social media, I would say Twitter is a really great place to get in contact with SFP doctors, because there are loads of us on Twitter and we are always very happy to answer questions. Something else you could do is consider getting involved in your careers team at your university, and asking your university for any information about any alumni that have left their contact details, because often past alumni will offer to help out SFP applicants at their university, and the university will keep a list of those people. So definitely contact them. So, do you need to have projects in the specialties included in the SFP program you're applying for? So You don't necessarily need to have a full project planned, because obviously that's quite hard to do so far in advance of the program. But what I would say is, if you are applying to deaneries such as Oxford, where they do look for kind of an understanding of the departments you're applying to and what you could potentially achieve, it's a good idea to try and contact the department that you're applying to in advance and find out about who you'd be working with and what specific things you could potentially get involved with, because then you have specific information about the program you're applying to that you could mention in your answer to show that you've thoroughly researched the deanery and you've already made an effort to start making contact and identify things that you could potentially contribute to. So, are you able to help get in touch with successful priority program applicants that you might know? I'm really sorry, I genuinely don't know anybody that applied to the priority program, I'm afraid. I will try and ask among some of my friends to see if there's somebody that I know through connections, but sorry, I'm afraid from my personal experience, I don't know anyone. Okay. Should I be tactical about SFP application? For instance, in the deanery I want to apply to, there are only 3 teaching posts and 35 research posts. So what I would say about being tactical in terms of where you apply and what programs you apply for is, bear in mind that when you're applying, you could ultimately get any of the posts that you apply to. And so what I would say is, from my experience and from the experience of people that have applied before me, only list the programs that you would genuinely be happy to do. Because if you got a post that was 35 out of 35 on your list, you wouldn't then subsequently be offered another SFP post that you might prefer later down the line. So it's worth being more selective at this phase, because even if you don't get an offer in the first round of the cascade system, you could potentially get access to a post that you would much rather have in one of the second or third cascades. And that would ultimately be obviously much better for your both personal and professional life, I'm sure. Does filling out the feedback form give access to the slides? So not specifically. So the slides hopefully will be uploaded to the Bite Medicine website anyway. I will be sending them over to Zach, so you will have access to the slides. The session has been recorded as well, so you should have access to the recording through both YouTube and the Bite Medicine website. But obviously the feedback does really help me, because I do read every single answer, and it really does help me improve my teaching going forward, to make sure that I'm covering exactly what you guys want to. Okay, so are there any more questions about the SFP? Oh, super random, but when I try to access last week's lecture, it just comes up with an error. I'm sorry about that. If you perhaps email the admin email at Bite Medicine, they should hopefully be able to get you access to last week's lecture. Okay, I'm just going to come back to that question where it said, if you had a publication that's been accepted, abstract from a conference but not yet published, can you include this, and would it likely be able to score points? So unfortunately, I don't believe abstracts from conferences count as publications, so unfortunately that wouldn't score you points in the application process, particularly for deaneries such as London. However, this is the kind of advantage of white space questions, because you could talk about the fact that you presented an abstract and it's been published in a journal as an abstract for a conference, and use that to kind of sell yourself as part of your research experience. So the key to white space questions is what you make of them. So really make sure that you take each achievement and sell them as much as possible to show off your skill set. Okay, so I think that is all the questions that we have today. So again, these are my contact details at the top of this slide. I'm very happy to answer questions if you think of some after the session. Thank you so much again for joining me tonight. I really appreciate your time, and I hope it was useful to you all. And on that note, I'm going to end the webinar there, and I hope I will see you all for the next session, which is on preparing for your interviews. Best of luck with writing your white space questions, and I'll see you all soon.